Despite the fact that for the overwhelming majority of human history, people have lived in tiny nomadic bands of no more than 100 people or so, the history of cities still goes back a fairly long time now. The earliest urban centers emerged in the 4th and 3rd millennia BCE in Mesopotamia, India, China, Egypt, and Peru, and since that time cities have sprung up all over the world. Today, over half the world's people are city dwellers, though this is a recent innovation, or some would argue, a degradation of human existence. Cities have always been characterized by high population densities, a fact that naturally leads to a plethora of problems. One of the primary such problems is, of course, where to even put all these people. For millennia, the simple answer was for a city to just keep fanning outward as more and more buildings were constructed to accommodate the increasing population and its needs. This wasn't really a problem for most of history, when the human population of the world was below 500 million. In the early 19th century, however, the global population hit 1 billion for the first time, and by the 1920s it had doubled to 2 billion. This massive increase in population was the result of the Industrial Revolution and the improvements in the standard of living that it brought, and the population has only grown exponentially since that time, as improved medicine and nutrition has lengthened the human lifespan and reduced the number of premature deaths. This transition has brought many benefits, but it's also created several problems. One such problem is the simple question of where to put all these extra people. It's no surprise, then, that one of the most drastic changes in the history of urban planning occurred at the tail end of the 19th century, when the population explosion was first ramping up. I'm talking, of course, about the invention of the skyscraper. The ability to build upwards, as opposed to outwards, dramatically increases the number of people who can live in any given area. The first skyscrapers, very loosely defined as any habitable building over 100 meters tall, emerged in New York City and Chicago, then quickly spread across the world. If the need to accommodate a rapidly multiplying population was the mother of the skyscraper's invention, the father was the development of steel frame architectural technology, along with curtain walls and electric elevators. The development of high-rise buildings has radically changed the way our cities look and function. The skylines of pre-20th century cities would have looked positively flat by comparison. For the most part, at least. In fact, there is one region of the world that developed vertical city planning centuries before anywhere else, and all without the benefit of industrial technology. In the heart of the Ramlat al-Sabatain Desert in central Yemen lies the ancient town of Shibam. Around 7,000 people call the 330 by 240 meter settlement home, making its population density higher than that of Manhattan. The town as it exists today dates mostly from the 16th century, though its earliest incarnation was founded around the year 300 AD, almost 3 centuries before the birth of the Prophet Muhammad. It was founded around this time as the capital of the region, after a catastrophic flood destroyed the old capital, Shabwa, which was located further to the west. The town is situated in an oasis at the edge of a river valley called the Wadi Hadramaut, an area highly prone to flooding. In fact, the current town was built in the mid-16th century, after yet another flood destroyed the last version in 1533. This time, the town's inhabitants rebuilt their remarkable settlement on a raised plateau in order to avoid a similar disaster in the future. This turned out to be a wise move, for the town they constructed has survived to the present day. But the location of the new town wasn't just beneficial in terms of its safety from flooding. It was located on a caravan route that brought spices, incense, and the profits from selling such luxuries into Shibam's coffers. This, in combination with local mining of silver and semi-precious stones, as well as the high agricultural fertility of the adjoining floodplain, led to the town becoming fabulously rich. However, Shibam's affluence presented 2 huge problems. The first was the fact that the town's wealth began to attract more and more people to it. Then, as now, people tended to want to live in rich, prosperous cities where there was a better chance of getting ahead financially. But as Shibam grew in population, it became increasingly apparent that its location on top of a plateau would soon become a limitation to further growth, as the floodplain below was unsuitable for building due to the fact that it was prone to frequent flooding, and also because the land was needed to grow crops to feed the increasing number of inhabitants. The second problem was the fact that Shibam's wealth didn't just attract peaceful immigrants and traders, but also violent raiders and conquerors who had no qualms about using force to appropriate the town's valuable commodities. The solutions Shibam's inhabitants came up with was to build up. Every aspect of the town's urban planning is strategic. A fortified wall was built to encircle the 330 by 240 meter settlement. This alone wasn't particularly innovative, as walled cities date back to the origins of urbanism itself. The design of Shibam's buildings, however, was radical at the time. The tallest of its towers rise 11 stories into the air, which provided safety for their inhabitants, as well as sweeping views of the surrounding landscape that allowed approaching enemy tribes to be seen long before they arrived at the city gates. Though the tallest of Shibam's buildings are around 40 meters in height, too short to be considered true skyscrapers by most modern definitions, they are still significantly taller than other residential buildings of their era, which never exceeded more than about 5 or 6 stories at most. Many of the buildings are connected by elevated bridges that allow people to move from one edifice to another without having to go outside. In addition to keeping the inhabitants safe during a raid, these bridges would have saved people energy and time in an era long before the invention of the elevator and the modern sedentary lifestyle that requires most people to consciously get their steps in order to stay physically fit. The bottom 2 floors of the buildings are usually windowless, again for purposes of defense, and were originally designed for storing grain and housing livestock. During raids, people would actually bring the animals up into the upper floors of the buildings to keep them from being stolen. But how did medieval people build such lofty structures without modern technology? Amazingly, the buildings are constructed of mud brick and are the tallest adobe buildings in the world. Due to their highly perishable nature, Shibam's buildings must be maintained constantly, and are still maintained today using the same techniques used in the 16th century. Therefore, unlike most 500-year-old buildings, we can still observe them being constructed and maintained more or less the same way that they would have been in the past. The bricks used to construct Shibam's buildings are made by mixing soil, water, and straw, forming the mixture into the proper shape using molds, and then allowing them to dry in the sun for several days. The floors of the buildings are made of wood and are supported by wooden columns. The mud brick walls are thicker on the ground floor and slowly become thinner with each story, and the outer walls are slightly inclined, lending more stability to the structure. Adobe walls must be thick in order to support the weight of the building they comprise. As a result of this, they moderate the interior temperature remarkably well, keeping such buildings cool in hot weather. Furthermore, the buildings at Shibam are packed closely together, which allows them to shade one another, a welcome feature in the blazing desert. However, mud brick buildings also have a major disadvantage. They weather extremely easily and must be constantly maintained. This wasn't as hard in the past, but with modernization, fewer and fewer people have the skills and knowledge necessary to maintain the traditional buildings. The ongoing civil war in Yemen, as well as its economic and infrastructural fallout, haven't helped either. Despite Shibam having largely avoided direct attacks, the war has absorbed most available resources that would be used to maintain the town's fragile architecture. Modernization has further jeopardized Shibam's structural and aesthetic integrity. Modern plumbing systems have overloaded the traditional infrastructure of the city and contributed to erosion, and ugly concrete buildings now blight the once purely traditional cityscape and compete with traditional methods of construction. In 2015, Shibam was added to UNESCO's list of World Heritage in Danger due to its vulnerability to natural and man-made threats. Technically, Shibam is protected by Yemen's Antiquities Law of 1997, as well as the General Organization for the Preservation of Historic Cities in Yemen, or GOPHCY, established in 1990 and funded by the European Union through UNESCO. However, many European governments, and also the United States I might add, also sell weapons to Saudi Arabia, which has led the Arab coalition and its military intervention in Yemen since 2015, contributing to the destruction of much of Yemen's infrastructure via airstrikes and ground offensives, at least until peace negotiations began relatively recently. Again, Shibam has remained largely unscathed by direct assaults, but the economic impact of the war has devastated its ability to be properly maintained. Currently, the GOPHCY has managed to implement a housing rehabilitation program that's documented 98% of the city's historical buildings and restored over 60% of them. But more funds are needed to complete the project. With any luck, the disastrous civil war will end soon, and Yemen will be able to start rebuilding. Of course, the most important goal should be to rebuild Yemen so that its people can live in safety, stability, and equality. But when this time does come, hopefully sooner rather than later, I hope the vernacular architectural traditions of this ancient land aren't left behind in the process. It would be a shame if such traditions were allowed to die out and fade into the past, only to be replaced by the soulless post-industrial architecture that has overtaken so much of the globe. The architecture of towns like Shibam has been developed over centuries using local materials and is near perfectly adapted to the climate and geography of this harsh desert region. Long live the walled city of Shibam, and long live the good people fighting to preserve it.